So g'day legends. I hope that you're having a fantastic day. And today I have a very, very special guest who we've been working on this for some time. And if you followed my channel, you will have seen parts of his book actually bought out. And I think such an important book written on protracted war that is so relevant currently with what we're seeing in Ukraine, and then what we could potentially see if there was some protracted conflict with someone like China. Now, the book I'm talking about is Planning for Protraction, written by Dr. Iskander Rehman. Of course, like the Iskander missile, which you may be familiar with. We had a bit of a laugh about that before. But, mate, firstly, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your work. I'm a big fan of the podcast. On another note, I also admire the courage and the positivity that you've been bringing in your fight against cancer, which I've also been tracking closely. So, yeah.
Oh, mate, look, thank you so much. I really, really do appreciate it. Look, if anyone is after the book, it's available anywhere. You could Google it. You'll find it somewhere. There'll be a link down below. And I really, really do recommend people read this at all levels of command as well. Like even at the NCO level, at the private, digger level, I think there's so much in this to take away. And I think so many of it, I see even some command mistakes or how maybe we view things through a lens which may not be super relevant. And we're seeing this unfold on battlefields actively. Before we get into this, can you just give, I guess, your credentials and your background?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. So as you can probably gauge from my accent, I was born in the UK, in London, where I spent the first 10 years of my life before my parents made the wise decision to move us all to the south of France. So I spent my middle school and high school years in France, went up to Paris to do my PhD, where I specialized in political science and Asia politics at a school called the Institute of Political Studies, or Sciences Po, in Paris. And then I moved to the US about 15 years ago now, initially for just a one-year fellowship at a think tank in Washington, D.C. But I fell in love with Washington, D.C., with the vibrancy of its national security and foreign policy ecosystem, and I also fell in love with a beautiful young American woman who subsequently became my wife. So that gave me an additional incentive to stay. And ever since, I've worked at various research institutes and think tanks. I'm currently at the RAND Corporation, where I work on a variety of defense-related issues. In terms of the areas that I focused on, I'd say that for the first decade of my career, I primarily self-identified and was viewed, I would say, as an Asia specialist. So my PhD was on the evolution of the Indian Navy since independence, and it blended military and diplomatic history with in-depth field work, interviews, and contemporary defense analysis. And so over the course of those years, I lived and worked in India. I traveled and lectured in a number of Asian countries, and I produced a series of studies or articles on Indo-Pacific defense issues, ranging from Taiwan's asymmetric defense to Australian defense strategy as well. In fact, I co-wrote a report with my friend and then colleague Zach Cooper back in 2014, so over 10 years ago now, where we actually advocated for Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. But we argued that it would probably never happen, that it was too unrealistic, even though it's what suited Australia's operational requirements, because we said, given domestic politics in Australia and the fact that Australia doesn't have a civilian nuclear industry, it's highly unlikely that it will happen. And then lo and behold, a decade later, we've seen that, things have actually changed quite a bit. So for the first decade or so, I worked primarily on Asia-related issues. But over time, I began to feel an urge to write about broader strategic issues, in addition to commenting on day-to-day military trends in Asia. I've long harbored a deep passion for the history of strategy and the history of warfare, along with a certain frustration at the sometimes superficial manner in which DC policy pundits engage with the past and engage in analogical reasoning. By temperament and training, I think I'm very much a historian. So even though I have a PhD in political science, and I think that that's in part because of where I earned my degree. So at Sciences Po in Paris, it's historically taken a very different and far more multidisciplinary approach to the study of what they prefer to the political sciences, emphasis on the plural than American academic institutions. So we're encouraged to combine the study of diverse disciplines, so ranging from history to comparative politics, to political philosophy, et cetera, rather than drilled into viewing one academic discipline as being a neatly self-contained sort of source of truth on international politics. And so for the past 8 years, therefore, I've been writing on issues pertaining to the history of grand strategy and the history of warfare, but all while retaining a deep interest in contemporary Asian defense issues and always trying to connect those historical insights to contemporary defense challenges. And so some of this time has been spent at think tanks, and some of it has been spent consulting for the US Department of Defense. And when I'm queried on my career path by younger think tankers or scholars or defense experts, I always tell them that my professional trajectory has been somewhat unorthodox, and therefore it's difficult to replicate, but I do remain convinced that it's much better to develop an ability to zoom in before trying to zoom out. So I always say, sort of, in short, work towards becoming a recognized expert, whether on a select issue, a specific period, or a key region before you start spouting on broader strategic issues. And I think that not only is that approach more sensible and marketable in today's hyper-competitive job market, but it also highlights an ability and a willingness to put in the work, to master the detail and to get into the policy weeds before you start talking about the sort of grander issues. So there we are. I'd say in a nutshell, that's sort of a slightly rambling overview of who I am and my research interests.
Mate, no, absolutely not. You can see, historical connections throughout your work to these contemporary conflicts or potential conflicts that, well, one major that is happening currently, and of course that changes day to day on what is happening. And we've seen, of course, a lot of different chapters throughout this war, from when Russia was really degraded to, then rebuilding and in industry changing and mobilization and all of this as well. I think you touch on, that great power, success, your grand strategy really, really well. And there's just a part of the book that I want to read here before we get into, I guess, the important factors of protracted war. And I think this is something which we needed to take into account more and move forward with, is countries rebounding after, great loss. And in chapter 2, the very beginning, protracted conflicts are extended cycles of action, counteraction, and experimental learning. As a result, the ability of a belligerent to adapt rapidly and decisively, whether in terms of training, tactics, or overarching military strategy, is critical. And this is what we have seen. Is we have seen both, if we go on where my main knowledge base is sitting at the moment, are in Ukraine and Russia, we have seen it's absolutely critical that they keep up to date with, technology coming or new tactics or changes in their home front as well, however that may be, even down to the success we saw with some weapons in the beginning, and then that drop off and other weapons come up. And then this continues and says, one should not necessarily assume that a competitor with little experience in one aspect of warfare is incapable, under the galvanizing pressures of combat, to rapidly overcoming its earlier deficiencies. And this is something, for the most prime example that comes to my mind is actually with Russian drone technology. And I think that we did drag our feet, thinking that they would not, under, to quote your words, the galvanizing pressures of combat, be able to build that base so quickly. We saw traditional AT weapons, traditional armored combat from the Russian forces that at that point in time, no armored force of that size had gone up against, these FPV drones, these highly effective, very cheap, comparatively weapon systems. And we saw how that went. And now we've seen that Russia, in my opinion, has transitioned to actually getting the upper hand on the drone battlefield. And it's all things to keep, I guess, in mind. But what would you say, as sort of an overview, are the most important factors when you talk about protracted warfare?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that there are two sort of simple and sequentially structured research questions that are at the heart of the book. So first of all, what are the key explanatory factors that have historically determined success in a protracted war between two great power competitors? And then based on those same identified factors in the grim event of a Sino-US protracted war, which state appears currently best positioned to prevail? And so when it came more specifically to the methodology, the goal was to engage in a detailed examination of past protracted peer-to-peer conflicts, so ranging a little further than the usual suspects, i.e. World War I and World War II, to also look at more underexplored case studies. So from the 100 Years' War to the Punic Wars, in order to identify across time and space the key factors, as you just mentioned, that consistently led to success or failure over the course of a protracted great power war. So what core insights can be gleaned in the process of answering these major research questions? So without rehashing the book in its entirety, I would make three overarching observations. The first most elementary observation is that the historical record clearly demonstrates that wars of protraction and attrition are the norm rather than the exception in the history of great power conflict. And that's something that we maybe forgot. And yet, despite this historical fact, short war thinking has all too often run aground on the jagged shoals of political reality, with states repeatedly underestimating the amount of pain, the amount of devastation that their determined adversaries could absorb prior to even contemplating surrender. And so while the opening phases of a high-intensity conflict are certainly critical, they're rarely determinative. So temporarily crippled opponents can recuperate, they can reknit the sinews of their strength, and they can wade back into the arena to reprise hostilities. So the armies that exit the brutal maelstrom of a protracted war often bear little resemblance, either in force design, capabilities, or training, to those which first entered it. And we've seen this, obviously, in Ukraine. And perhaps most importantly, military planners have consistently struggled to think and plan beyond the first salvo or their conception of the decisive battle. So to give but one example, prior to 1914, the French army, like all the other warring parties, had grievously underestimated the ammunition needs of its artillery. So I have some interesting figures here. So, for example, the French army entered the Great War with a stockpile of approximately 5 million 75mm shells. Its pre-war plans estimated a consumption rate of 100,000 rounds of artillery monthly. And this estimate proved to be grossly in error as early as 1914, so the first year of conflict, when the French were firing an average of 900,000 shells per month. So the French munitions industry made huge efforts to meet the demands for these shells, and by 1916, France's total monthly artillery consumption rate was a monthly average of 4.5 million rounds. So in short, this difficulty in planning for the future and this chronic underestimation of the cost of future high-intensity conflicts, whether in terms of manpower or materiel, isn't just a today problem. So in some ways, it's almost part and parcel of human nature. The second, equally sobering, but altogether unsurprising observation is that protracted great power wars are immensely destructive whole of society affairs, the effects of which typically extend well beyond their point of origin. They spill across multiple regions, and they siphon huge amounts of personnel, material, and resources. So even conflicts that start out as seemingly isolated or dyadic affairs have a tendency to draw in other actors. So whether those are scavenging opportunists, old or newly formed allies, or concerned third parties. And of course, we've witnessed that in Ukraine, where you've had Syrian mercenaries, Iranian operatives, and now North Korean soldiers fighting alongside the Russian aggressors. Meanwhile, you have extra-regional countries such as Japan, Australia, of course, South Korea, that have been supplying Ukraine with financial aid. In the case of Australia and South Korea, also military aid, South Korea in particular, large and much-needed volumes of munitions. So I think we now all understand that this is much more than a European war. And furthermore, when thinking about how to prevail in such draining marathons, neat quantifiable metrics such as ships, munitions, stockpiles, and logistical inventory certainly matter. but so do less easily measurable factors. So what the great British scholar Sir Michael Howard, for example, famously termed the forgotten dimensions of strategy, such as a state's capacity for scientific innovation, its societal resilience, and the quality and the robustness of its alliances, and how shrewdly it can leverage those same alliances in service of its own war effort. And third, and perhaps most importantly, to answer your main question, this book argues that the final victory ultimately rests on a combination of three core factors. So those three core factors are, first of all, a state's military effectiveness and intra-war adaptability that you touched on just now. Second, its socioeconomic power and resiliency. And third, the soundness of its alliance management and its grand strategy.
Yeah, it's all a very in-depth thing, especially when we're looking at this war, because, you know, we start with, as you said, you know, two warring parties, and then other nations start getting brought in either by military aid or even down to ex-fighters going as now foreign fighters in, potentially other nations being brought in with the potential of North Korean artillery crews, even down to claims of North Korean frontline special forces soldiers. And we see this ability to expand and even ability to end and move into proxy. What do you think is that has drawn a lot of Western analysts or even commanders into this short-term or short war thinking, that the war is going to be done and dusted, we'll win very quickly? And I even saw this in military exercise, that the exercises would be a few weeks and then you would win, and not this, to use the title of your book, the planning for protraction, that this, you say, is a norm in war, that it goes into major powers, it sinks into being a protracted conflict. And what is then leveraged is your allies, your industrial capacity, your economics, the resilience of your societies, these factors, rather than, I think, where we could be stuck maybe, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this Middle Eastern war, insurgency style warfare. How much do you think that is affecting command or analysis decisions at the moment?
So I think some of it is a certain form of historical amnesia, because since the end of the Cold War, we've been involved in a number of grueling counterinsurgency campaigns, but we had not yet been involved in a more serious form of confrontation with a major peer competitor. And so in that sense, perhaps, with the analytical focus on revolutions in military affairs, RMAs, etc., with the superlative display of technological wizardry and military efficiency during the first Gulf War, there was perhaps a form of historical amnesia that set in. When in fact, if you just look back to the Korean War, for example, the early years of the Cold War, that was a very costly and attritional conflict, which, you know, in some ways is quite reminiscent of the current war in Ukraine, which was also, you know, a conflict that drew in external actors and proxies as well. You could also look at the Spanish Civil War as another example of a regional war that drew in a number of different actors. So there's part of historical amnesia. I also think that it's a lot more analytically challenging to think beyond the first salvo. And it's all the more analytically challenging because the opening phases of a conflict are often critical. So you do have to think about, you know, what the US Air Force calls, you know, the first night operations, etc. You do have to think about the, you know, the first few days of confrontation in the Taiwan Strait. But then in parallel, you also have to think along a different timeline. And so you have to sort of fuse short-term war thinking, or, you know, critical first phase thinking, with a broader reflection on the industrial requirements, logistical requirements, socioeconomic requirements that come with waging a major war against a serious peer competitor. So historical amnesia, the analytical challenge of thinking along several distinct timelines, and that also goes for military investments, you know, the kind of investments you want to make, whether you want to, you know, invest more in long-term R&D, or, you know, in short-term military capacities. And then I also think it's just occasionally it can just be too grim to contemplate, really. There is something comforting to us all to focus on short, sharp wars where escalation can somehow be controlled, and where the conflict doesn't devolve into a grueling slugging match. Unfortunately, the historical record and our current experience in Ukraine would suggest otherwise.
And I think it brings out a lot of really critical things at the moment. And you speak on the French shells, and we have had the exact again.
Exactly.
I think shells is the best example to look at in this, and look at. I think in the book you quote near the end, maybe you quote that Russia was firing as many shells in 2 days that the UK had in stock, in their stockpile, something along those lines. Just an unbelievable amount of munitions
in the initial phases of the conflict.
And still what we have seen is that the Western stockpile of shells, their capacity to make shells, is completely below what it should have been. And this is in a fairly, and I will call it a fairly limited war. It is involving Russia and Ukraine in the beginning opening phases. And I look at it, and what concerned me was, well, if other countries stepped into this, we would run out of shells in days. We would just not have 155.
I mean, there has certainly been an effort to ramp up production, but it's not yet attained its self-fixed objectives, and there's still a lot of work to do for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And that takes a very long time, especially with democratic capitalist nations. It does take a long time because you don't have a vertical authoritarian structure where it can be more easy potentially to just implement economic and military industry changes amongst a variety.
So sadly, we don't have the latent industrial capacity that, for example, France had during World War I, or that the US had during World War II. So it's also rebuilding an industrial capacity that we had lost, or that had atrophied over many years.
I think an important point there, as a former soldier myself, is you speak about people maybe not wanting to really face, I guess, the grim reality of how this would look too. I was speaking interstate recently to other infantry soldiers, and I was saying, like, look, the wars that you may have participated in, the operations, and what we're seeing, this is vastly different. I said, over the 20 years of Afghanistan, we lost just over 40 men from the Australian forces. I said that we that wouldn't even be a day. We could lose 10 times that. We could lose 20 times that in every day, day on day on day. And this is the reality that we need to face, is that if you're a private soldier, you may, in a week, step up into a command position. You may have huge losses, and this is something that the levels of command, even if you're lower command, you can end up in mid to high command, need to take really into example. And it may be, it's not sexy, it's not fun to think about, especially as if you're an infantry soldier, of the reality. The reality isn't, going into villages and doing urban warfare combat, cool drills, this and that. That's 1% of the battle. A lot of the battle sitting in trenches, retreating forces, and trying to be the ones who would retreat more slowly, and then society's ability to endure. And we, of course, in this war have two very, very resilient societies, historically incredible. Just look at the 20th century, for instance. And I think that has played into both countries' successes on the battlefield and ability to actually sustain as well. What is it that you think in a protracted attritional war that Russia and Ukraine have done well?
That's a great question. So to your point about morale, war, Clausewitz memorably observed, is often saturated by great moral forces that leave it with what he called a leaven of its own. So you're absolutely right to note that a protracted great power war is above all an extended clash of national wills, and the preservation of military and civilian morale, even in the face of severe loss and deprivation, has to be at the heart of any viable theory of victory. Of course, the problem with this is that it can be difficult to measure leading up to a conflict. And this aspect of great power competition may seem at first almost impossibly woolly, almost impossibly difficult to measure. But in fact, what's interesting is that I found over the course of working on this book that in fact during World War I and World War II, national governments actually directed a considerable amount of energy towards the study of military and public morale. And they drew from the nascent fields of psychology and behavioral science in addition to sociology and economy. So to give but one example, it was shown that for soldiers deployed for long stretches in the trenches along the Western Front, the sheer tedium and sense of powerlessness, along with the complete lack of knowledge of when the war might end, was often actually the prime source of psychological collapse rather than the experience of combat itself. The Germans, for example, famously referred to the combat occurring on the Eastern Front, which was more mobile and fast-paced, as being a muscle war, and the conflict on the Western Front, which was often slower and more attritional, at least during certain years of the war, as being more of a nerve war. So for military personnel serving in a protracted war, the passage of time in and of itself possesses something of an erosive quality of not knowing when the war is going to end. And that's something that we're also seeing play out in Ukraine with, growing discontent within Ukrainian civil society over the recently expanded mobilization drive. And the duration of time soldiers are forced to spend on the front lines before rotating out, and more importantly, the uncertainty as to how long they're going to be on the front line before they rotate out. And one of the reasons, to go back to World War I, why General Pétain in France was so venerated in the aftermath of World War I was because of his understanding of the importance of morale during the terrible Battle of Verdun, and his institutionalization of the so-called Noria, which was named after a type of watermill, which was a more effective and humane rotation system to help troops not succumb to extreme fatigue and shell shock over the course of extended deployments on the front lines. And then, of course, there's the issue of civilian morale that we could get into if you like. But I mean, to answer your question about the areas where the Ukrainians and the Russians have respectively fared well, I think in many ways the Russian military, at least in the first year or so of the conflict, performed extremely poorly and far below the collective expectations of even folks who spend most of their time specializing on the Russian military in this town. And I should specify up front that I'm not an expert on the Ukrainian military or on the Russian military, for that matter. But I will say that there are certain narratives that took hold in this town, and maybe in the broader commentariat, that were somewhat too facile. I think we have a tendency to sometimes analytically overcorrect. So in the first few months leading up to the conflict, the conventional narrative was that the Ukrainians were no match for the well-honed Russian war machine that had been rebuilt after its operations in Georgia and in 2014 and in Syria, and that basically the Ukrainians would probably only last a few days before collapsing. And the actual planning in Washington was to assist the Ukrainians in a counterinsurgency effort against, a victorious Russian army. That conventional narrative was soon belied by the facts. But then soon after, I think that there was another narrative that set in, which consisted in an underestimation, I would say, of Russia's ability to both absorb grievous human losses and to adapt itself as well. And so I think we always have to be careful, because there are the equivalent of sort of intellectual trends in our community, and it can be easy to sort of fall into one narrative or another, when in reality, as we were mentioning earlier, the brutal experience of combat has a way of turbocharging experiential learning and forcing even relatively lumbering and ineffective military such as Russia's to eventually adapt.
Well, that would be the biggest thing I think that is underestimated currently in the war, is that the Russian forces which invaded on the 24th of February 2022 to what it looks like now is a significantly different fighting force. And I think there was this lumbering, to use a word there, idea that they won't actually adapt. And we really greatly underestimated that ability to adapt to drones on the battlefield, to adapt to how this changes your armored warfare, how all this can change. And as well, I think one of the biggest things that I've seen that has been a success, if we'll put it that way, for the Russians to make ground over the past 12 to 15 months, I think has actually been accepting that this is then an attritional battlefield, rather than this idea that we're going to have some level of maneuver warfare back of what we may have done in Iraq somewhere to have success for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, rather than leaning in that this is attritional. We have to then move forward on making sure that we are in the best position possible, that our calculations are in the positive for us. That's where I would see where the Russians have had success, and why currently on the battlefield that they are currently the party with having a far more victories over the past 12 months. I think it's been the exception of attrition. Accepting that this is attritional, we're going to have huge cost, but also that many countries, and I believe one of them is Ukraine's command, underestimate Russia's ability to adapt, if not very slowly. As they say, the Russians are very slow to stand up, but the ability to adapt to things like drones on the battlefield, and now where Ukraine has had for the first 2.5 years of the war the upper hand on drones, absolutely objectively had the upper hand. We now see the Russians.
Now that's no longer necessarily the case. Yes.
With that, do you think, is this idea that accepting the battle and seeing it for the realities of attrition or protraction is important for then making correct command decisions?
I think so, yes. And I think it's also to not seek necessarily to establish too clear-cut distinction in between wars of attrition and annihilation when it comes to protracted conflict. So what I've noticed is that protracted wars can have a very uneven respiratory rhythm, if you will. So at certain periods, campaigns can move at a remarkably brisk pace, and then at others they can get bogged down in a more attritional phase. And so it goes with military innovation. So sometimes you'll see almost blindingly rapid cycles of technological breakthroughs followed by their counters, and of adaptation and counter-adaptation. And at others you may enter a much more stagnant phase. So consider, for example, and sorry, I'm going to talk about World War I again, but I do think it holds a lot of relevance to this current conflict. So contrary to conventional wisdom, World War I was in fact characterized by remarkably rapid cycles of technological and tactical innovation. And it transitioned from great wars of movement in its opening phases to meat grinding positional battles of attrition, like the Battle of Verdun, the Somme, in its terrible median phase. And then it reverted back again to sweeping battles of maneuver with hundreds of tanks, like the Second Battle of the Marne in the summer of 1918. And much more recently, in Ukraine, I think we witnessed some remarkably rapid cycles of adaptation and counter-adaptation unfold over the course of the war. And what's particularly interesting to me is you've sometimes seen seemingly curious blends of cutting-edge and more antiquated technology, or of civilian and military platforms. So if you consider, for example, the role played by repurposed and adapted commercial technology, such as modified agricultural and consumer FPV drones to perform reconnaissance or bombing missions, or, for example, the fielding of so-called turtle tanks, those tanks wrapped in corrugated iron sheets or Mad Max-style cages to protect themselves from loitering munitions or drone strikes, or Russia's alarming recent successes in jamming American GPS-guided munitions, for example. Another example one could give is, of this sort of blending of the antiquated with the new is Russia's very effective use of Soviet-era Russian FABs, or high explosive aviation bombs, modified into glide bombs by retrofitting them with satellite guidance systems and wings. So in future conflicts, you're going to see a lot of this sort of tinkering, and a lot of this sort of experimental innovation that seeks to sort of fuse cutting edge technology with older platforms.
And you touch on in the book, and something that I speak on a lot in this war, is this, that quantity is a quality of its own in protracted warfare. And we may see that, you know, a Storm Shadow missile is a significantly better system technologically than a Fab 500. But the amount Ukraine has, the expense of which they are at a few $1 million a pop.
Yeah, the cost exchange ratio. Yeah.
Cost exchange to then Russia can just strap on some glide kits onto some old bombs that they made a long time ago, put it under Su-34 and glide them in. And, you know, in the beginning, they weren't that accurate, but then they can work that out and you can go off just quantity of weapon systems. I think that, and I've even said this back when I was in the forces, I do believe that I think our privatized military industrial sector is almost too focused on R&D rather than just quantity of systems. Now, I know there's a lot of reasons around finances why this may be, but do you think that has been something that we have learnt through this war, is, as you sort of touch on, even from agricultural drones being made into, you know, the Baba Yaga being able to drop to FPV drones, and the Ukrainian forces pulling apart, say, cluster munitions, because they would rather use the bomblets out of a cluster on FPVs than fire the cluster. Do you think that we have had too much of a focus on high tech rather than just high quantity of systems?
Yeah, I do think that there is a danger of focusing too much on exquisite high-end systems, especially when you consider the fact that over the course of a protracted war, you're probably going to run out of the expensive, exquisite high-end stuff pretty fast in the first phases of conflict. And so you're going to need to regenerate mass. So ease of production is going to be a huge factor, but then also the simplicity of use of said platforms, because over the course of a protracted conflict, you're going to have to engage in several mobilization waves. And so you're going to, the competitor which is more effective at rapidly inducting and training new troops will have a decisive edge. So in that sense, you don't necessarily want to be dealing with a lot of fresh recruits who have to spend months and months learning how to operate highly sophisticated platforms when, you know, you're embroiled in an existential conflict. Yes. So that's one thing to take into consideration, and that's something also that is, you know, that has come up when various allies have been engaging in their own large-scale training efforts of Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are incredibly adept at absorbing new technologies, but they definitely themselves will place a premium on rugged, simple-to-use systems that can be, you know, that can be rapidly deployed to great effect across the force. And then a third factor I'd mentioned, this is something that I held into a little bit in the book, is that in the event of a high-end conflict against a sophisticated adversary such as Russia or China, for example, that possess extensive cyber and electronic warfare capabilities, there is a high possibility that forces will need to learn how to fight dark in a communications denied environment. And so in that sense, that also forces one to sort of reacquaint themselves with certain aspects of military training that may have atrophied over the past. So for example, at the Naval Academy in the United States, they have reintroduced celestial navigation in recent years to a much greater degree, because they realize that, you know, their naval officers may be operating in a comms denied environment in the future, you know, and so it's important to know how to use a sextant. It's important to know how to read a complex map, et cetera, et cetera.
That's something that I couldn't agree more on, is in the recent conflicts of which the West has been involved in, we have had a significant upper hand in technology, everything from GPS to drones to air dominance or air superiority. And as a former infantryman, I look at it and I go, well, if we step into a protracted conflict where this can be a denied environment, denied of GPS, denied of SATCOM, denied of a whole range of things, the importance to fight dark is there. And I actually think, at least in the Australian forces, we are starting to have a realization of, hey, look, your Garmin 401 might not work at all.
Yeah.
You may need to be on a map and compass and carrying ammunition and water for 3 or 4 days, because we may not even be able to get a delivery to you. And that fighting dark element when going up against a major power like this is something we think will come very hard and fast. I even had a realization when I was in the north of Israel, and I was like, I was so on Google Maps, and of course it's a GPS denied environment, and I'm like, oh, I've got to work this out myself again. How do I do this again? And that's even on a very, that's still
on a personal level. I mean, we've all become terribly reliant on these technologies. I mean, I've always had a terrible sense of orientation, but it's definitely got a lot worse since I've been relying on Google Maps.
Yeah.
It's part of your brain that atrophies almost.
Do you think this is something that the Soviets did well with building their equipment, was the ability for simple weapon systems and the ability to mobilize vast amounts of people quickly? Because that's one thing we do see the simplicity over, say, a T-72 compared to an M1 Abrams, and the difference in capability in the Gulf War. It's dramatic, but in a protracted conflict where you may have 10 to 1, 20 to 1, and the ability to mobilize, is this something that they have done well, and the Russians, I believe, continue to somewhat do well as far as the ability for simple weapon systems en masse to get into the field?
I think so, to a certain degree, and that also applies to ammunition shells in the sense that they can source additional ammunition shells from a number of foreign countries who have somewhat more antiquated inventories, whereas when it comes to the West trying to supply the Ukrainians with 155 millimeter shells, thank God the South Koreans were there, because otherwise we would be facing an even greater inventory shortage. I believe, I'd have to look at the latest figures, but I believe that the South Koreans have single-handedly provided more shells to the Ukrainians than the entire European Union, and that in large part is because South Korea has been forced to maintain itself in a state of military readiness for the past several decades, because of the fact that it is technically still in conflict with North Korea.
Yeah, and this is something we see is the North Koreans delivered more shells, albeit definitely inferior quality, but they delivered more shells than the entire EU over the course of the last months. And that is something which I think should be a very large concern, as you've got a dictatorship with the people using bloody, a shovel in the field and living without food, with the ability to provide more shells into a war zone than in the greatest economies on earth. I think this should be of real concern, and a wake-up call yesterday that I still think we're slugging along. I think the West has this idea of dominance, of we will just have air superiority. There was an American senior ranking member, I can't remember who he was or what rank, but high enough rank to be being interviewed on television, who came out with, we're not worried about drone warfare as we assume we'll have air superiority in the next conflict, in the next theater. And me thinking, this does not add up, mate. As far as air superiority, you may be talking air defense systems and fighter aircraft, but the battle space of the air now has gone from everything from your short range FPVs to long range drones all the way through to your supersonic bombers. And I think there is a very slow catch up on this, and maybe because the West is not in that grinding aspect of war, we have to adapt so quickly. We're still removed from it. It is Ukraine doing the fighting, us doing the supplying, that we are not having that massive force of adaptation.
No, I agree. I mean, I hope that we'll end up drawing the right lessons from the war in Ukraine.
Yeah. And how much of effect in the analytical community, how much of effect do you think that propaganda is actually having on this? Because we have seen a lot of these predictions, what we're being told, being very, very incorrect. All from that, Russia will conquer Ukraine in a matter of days, coming from narratives before the war, through to, throughout 2022, that the Russians only have one more salvo of missiles, to 2023, that the economy is imminently going to collapse, and all of this. How much of an effect, I guess, in your communities do you think that the propaganda, and even down to people not wanting to go against the grain due to being criticized online, how do you think, that has actually affected the way people analyze a situation from a realistic point of view more than idealistic and bias?
That's a great question. I wouldn't necessarily refer to it as propaganda, but more as sort of on occasion groupthink or conventional narratives. I think it can be difficult sometimes to go against the grain, whether that's in Washington or Canberra or elsewhere. I do hope that this conflict, the analytically bruising experience of this conflict, will force us all to up our game. And I would add that I think that this is also where the close study of history can be of great assistance, because history teaches humility, it teaches nuance, it teaches multi-causality, it teaches one to both embrace and love complexity when one is seeking to explain hugely consequential issues such as great power war. So I think in that sense, it can truly be helpful.
Yeah, I think too that there was, and you speaking of you looking at history to apply to current day, when you look back and go over some of these articles or media outlets that were releasing, about Russia's significant losses in the early days of the war, and still to this day, but this idea that people are now shocked that the Russians were able to absorb large losses. And you just have to step back into the Second World War and go, look at the losses that the Soviets took, and the ability to absorb that, and the idea, thinking from the German side of they won't be able to absorb these massive crushing defeats, these massive losses, led to a lot of poor command decisions being made, and to ultimate defeat there too. I look back and go, yeah, this is ridiculous to think that, yes, there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of losses, but we have very recent historical evidence that the Soviets at the time, now, as the collapse of the Russians, the idea that they're going to run out of shells in the first few days, when there's been paranoia about a war with NATO ever since, that there's going to be a significant amount of shells, and we've seen that the ability to absorb losses is there, and for some reason that sort of got lost in the wind in the initial years of the war, and now I think we're seeing a lot of backpedaling on some of that analysis.
Yeah. I also think that when it comes to analyzing morale, national staying power, socioeconomic resiliency, etc. As I mentioned earlier, it can be an incredibly challenging intellectual enterprise, and I think it's even more so when you're dealing with authoritarian regimes that are more opaque than their democratic rivals, and where on occasion certain residual strengths can be concealed, but also certain forms of brittleness. And occasionally things can unravel with, astonishing speed in authoritarian regimes. I mean, we saw that recently with the collapse of the Syrian government. But in other instances, they can prove far more resilient than one might have initially expected. So the the Kim dynasty in North Korea, for example, I think has proved a lot more resilient than many people might have anticipated. The Islamic Republic of Iran as well, in many instances. And when it comes to Putinist Russia, it's very difficult to know to what extent it can sustain its current war economy without that generating irreparable or unsustainable social pressures, without the economy overheating, et cetera, et cetera. And that in many instances is just because we don't have a very good insight into the black box that is, the Kremlin and Putin's close entourage. During the Cold War, we had a body of exceptional Kremlinologists who would spend a lot of time focusing on every aspect of Soviet politics, every arcane statement. Now, I think, unfortunately, in large part because for quite a few years we saw Russia very much as a second-tier threat, that body of knowledge has slightly atrophied as well, and it's going to take some time to rebuild it. There are some excellent Russia experts and some excellent observers of Russian politics, but they are few and far between. We just don't have enough of them.
Yeah, and I do think that there is still a lot of effect on if you have an opinion of, hey, look, if you were to come out as an expert and say that, look, they may be able to sustain this loss rate, or they don't have one more salvo of missiles, I do think there can be a huge effect through even social media, through to governments, and painting someone as the new term for calling someone, if you're in an argument with someone and they call you a racist, and it's like, well, hang on, that just, nullifies any argument from there, has been this, oh, you're pro-Putin, you're pro-Russia, is any opinion against, I guess, the narrative of everything's collapsing. And I personally think that has had huge effect on a lot of, from journalists to professional analysts, of their willingness to sort of step into the dark and have a look at reality and go, well, they're not going to be out of shells in the first month. That's not going to be the case. But I think if you had a separate opinion of that, people will automatically see you as some level of Kremlin puppet being used. And I think that alone, even like your online sphere, which of course
it has a bit of a chilling effect. Yeah,
I think it has had a huge effect on that. I had an economist on just the other day, and he's Eastern European doctor of economics, and he basically said, look, my view of the economy here is that it is sustainable at this point. It's going to have lasting effect, but from what we saw of military expenditures throughout history on times, it does look like they may be able to maintain this, although it will have post-war attrition too. And instantly he will get put as, oh, he's working for the Kremlin. And I think that takes away a lot of ability to analyze something unbiased. I think that is something after the war we'll see has had a huge impact on actually being able to look at the war as a whole for the reality of what is occurring. And the success of information online too.
Yeah, sure. And I'd even add that it's doing a disservice to our courageous Ukrainian partners, where we also refuse to look at certain issues or pathologies on the Ukrainian side, or when one refuses to raise the issue of troop mobilization, for example, because of its political sensitivities in Ukraine. But I do think that going forward, especially with the current administration, it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to make a case for continued US military support if it's not going to vastly expand its mobilization drive to include, men from the ages of 18 to 25. Unfortunately, that is something I'm fully aware of. Ukraine's demographic challenges, its unique demographic challenges, which is, similar to many post-Soviet states, and the degree to which, I'm very sympathetic to their desire. I'm very sympathetic with their desire to, to preserve that generation for the future. But at the same time, when you're embroiled in an existential struggle for your survival, I think it's going to be very hard to not, fully grapple with those politically sensitive issues by expanding the mobilization drive.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I've touched on these topics before about, I think, a lot of this information war of, the Russians have nothing left, that we are having, massive success on the battlefield, all this information leaning into misinformation and propaganda in some cases has had a huge impact on then people's willingness to sign up. And in the, first, second years of the war, where everything was painted as going fantastically on the front line, we saw Ukraine have a huge dip in manpower numbers. And then in the third year, things really start going negatively. I think there's a lot of guys going, well, I thought we were having massive, I thought everything was being defeated. The Russians were imminently going to collapse. I'm not going to sign up at this point. And I think you make a fantastic point about US support with the mobilization sitting at 25 years old. And of course, with respect to the demographic issues, but this is what I've been calling the manpower paradox, is Ukraine is stuck in an existential war in which, if they don't mobilize at that, they will lose, in my opinion, they will lose the existential war if they don't. But at the same time, the Ukrainian lawmakers...
They risk losing everything in that case, yes.
But they're saying, but if we do mobilize this, then Ukraine won't have a future. I'm calling this the paradox of, well, if it's existential, like it's existential if you do or you don't, it's a very, very difficult situation. And the US, I think especially with President Trump at the moment, very transactional type leader, we were looking at that standard of which America would mobilize needs to be added there if there's a continuation of military aid or funding. And this is something, speaking on morale, and of course your historical warfare knowledge is 50 times mine, and 50 times is probably putting it at less than it is. But what do you think that there could be an effect on the morale at the front line, given the recent statements from Washington, from the administration, the current administration, around wanting to end the war, and looking like, if you listen to Pete Hegseth or Donald Trump statements, not in the outcome which was promised from Kyiv or promised from the EU of an irreversible path to NATO, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. How much effect do you think that could have on the front line? You have a chapter called, well, not called, but it touches on the trauma of defeat, and that there's huge problems for the country even after the war as well. How much of effect do you think a decision like that, even at this point in time, with just it being said publicly, how much of effect do you think that could have on troops at the front line?
Well, I mean, at this stage, it's very hard to tell. Of course, I can only imagine that the current uncertainty surrounding the format and the content of the planned negotiations. I can only imagine that is extremely morally challenging for a lot of Ukrainians. The most important thing for me is that both the Ukrainians and the Europeans, for that matter, have a voice in these negotiations. And going forward, I think we will have to recognize, realistically speaking, that within the US, there is not as much of an appetite as there was a few years ago, unfortunately, in my opinion, for supporting the Ukrainians to the same degree. And so the onus really is on the Europeans at this stage, and other democratic partners such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, etc., to continue to support the Ukrainians so that they can be in the strongest possible position at the time of negotiations with the Russians.
Yeah, I think this comes with a number of challenges, though, because I would put, as someone who looks at this war, every waking moment, I would put, I don't know how we would put the Ukrainians in a vastly better, because it doesn't just need to be a slightly better position. It needs to be in a vastly better position. It needs to not lose
I agree.
10, 20 square kilometers a day, problems all over the front line of morale. But I put the two largest problems are manpower shortages and command. And there's a lot of people in agreement with that. And this is becoming more relevant to speak of. And these are both things which the West can have, like European states and countries like Australia, New Zealand, Japan. They can have some effect, but they're not going to have overwhelming effect. If Ukraine is flat refusing to mobilize below 25, and we can pour in all the weapons we'd like, but if we see the thousands of thousands getting transferred from critical second line actions, from the Air Force, from other areas to the frontline infantry, with morale crisis and questions around command, my question would be, is it realistic that the West can put Ukraine into a position of power? Or, I guess to quote Mr. Pete Hegseth, that we need to be realistic about where this is going to look, because there is people saying that the Europeans will fight to the last Ukrainian, and that would be even a worse outcome than a loss of land. And what the current administration will talk of is we need to be realistic about what could actually be a realistic outcome of this. The real situation of how are the Russians, can they continue fighting? And I think Trump is looking at that they can. I don't have the information available that he may have. But do you think that there is any way that the Europeans, without the US, can deliver what's needed, or the training, whatever, to put Ukraine actually not just stepping rearwards and slowing the Russian advance, but the ability to actually be in, a quote Zelensky's favorite words, of a position of power?
Well, I think that this is where the issue of putative security guarantees becomes critical. The Trump administration has made it clear that it objects to Ukraine joining NATO. So the question is, can the Europeans offer some kind of viable and credible security guarantee to the Ukrainians? Because, of course, the main concern that one has is that, signing any kind of peace deal with Vladimir Putin would just simply provide him with the time and resources he needs to rebuild his strength, with the expectation that he would, attack Ukraine again at some later date, or perhaps some NATO ally. So the more challenging question is whether the Europeans are both willing and capable to provide some kind of credible security guarantee to the Ukrainians. There are some European leaders, such as the French president, for example, who have floated the idea of deploying European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, which presumably would be positioned along the lines of any settlement. But for the time being, that seems to be a minority position within the European Union, but that could change. And then there's the other broader question of whether a Russian attack or act of aggression against these European peacekeeping forces, whether the US would consider that as being, a reason to invoke Article 5 or not. And it's not clear to me that there's sufficient clarity around those key points as of now. But obviously my heart goes out to the Ukrainians.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anyone can deny the fight that the Ukrainians have put forward. But I think we're getting to a point where if you're going to have countries start stepping back, especially the US, that it needs to be seen as, it may not be what's fair or ethical or moral, but what is realistic at this point in time. And if the US step out, are you going to then have a catastrophe of morale? Because my biggest concern with the US stepping back, as a former soldier, is trying to put myself in the boots of a guy on the front line who's
course.
been there for years, who has fought. They've lost so much of their friends, their mates, their home, their family. They've given so much for Kyiv, and then the US step away is leading
Of
into a
course.
catastrophe where these guys go, well, there's already a desertion crisis in Ukraine. We know the courts,
Yeah.
60,000 to 80,000 going through. You're only charged from your second case. Then we end up with this catastrophic
And the
event.
mobilization dodging crisis as well.
We end up with this catastrophic event where Russia starts taking 200 square kilometers a day rather than 10. And we end up in a position that may actually be worse. But that, of course, will all go into the calculation of, does Russia have the capacity to continue, and does Europe have, do they have the stamina in their processes to be able to continue supplying the Ukrainians? And I guess the want to continue doing it too, because in democratic countries you can have a large swing very quickly. Especially in Germany is going to be a big one of that in the very near future. Now, look, we'll go over this quickly to step into another area of the world with China.
Yeah.
How much of a near peer militarily, and I guess that goes into their industry as well, how close is China to the US currently?
That's a very good question. So it's also a challenging one, but I tried to tackle it in the book by sort of analyzing it along the three aforementioned axes that I mentioned. So combat effectiveness and adaptability, socioeconomic power, industrial resiliency, and also alliances and grand strategy. So if we look at the first of the three pre-identified core determinants of success in a protracted great power war, so if we look at which actor between the US and China is likely to hold a clear edge in terms of military effectiveness and intra-war adaptability. So at first blush, it would appear self-evident that the US joint force, by virtue of its extensive combat experience, its full spectrum gamut of capabilities, and its highly trained personnel, holds an advantage. Now it's become something of a cliche to observe that Beijing has not fought a large-scale conflict since its mediocre performance during the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979. And in addition, I would argue the PLA's relative lack of proximity with the world's most advanced and experienced Western militaries has deprived the PLA of the opportunity to sharpen its warfighting capabilities through the experience of sophisticated joint training. And indeed, the only experienced and technologically advanced military with whom China currently engages in training for high-intensity warfare is Russia's. Meanwhile, of course, US troops regularly take part in highly realistic multinational warfighting exercises with a wide variety of international partners. And I think that provides them with the opportunity in some cases to actually gain experiential learning from their smaller allies' expertise in niche areas. And then last but not least, the increased politicization of the PLA under the leadership of Xi Jinping, which is something that I delve into in the book as well. So most notably, the renewed emphasis on ideological indoctrination, which according to some accounts takes up about 25% of an officer's training time, the empowerment of political commissars. This may come to undermine the professionalism of its officer corps, or at least negatively impact their capacity for personal initiative and hence intra-war adaptability. Then another area in which the PLA would currently find itself at a distinct disadvantage in the event of a protracted war is in its ability to engage in sustained long-range power projection. And this could emerge as a particularly important area of weakness should the US, either alone or in combination of its allies, decide to enact a distant blockade or engage in opportunistic attacks against extra-regional Chinese military assets and overseas bases. As numerous sinologists have highlighted, the PLA currently only has a limited ability for conducting complex joint operations beyond the so-called second island chain. And as of now, all of the PLAN's overseas operations or exercises have been conducted in permissive environments, and few can be truly characterized as joint in the way we would understand them. So given all these factors, at first glance, the US military's advantages in a protracted war, whether in terms of their adaptability, their logistical advantages, or geographical positioning, might seem self-evident. That said, and this is a big caveat, both history and the pace and scale of China's current reforms should warn against complacency. So first of all, the PLA is keenly aware of the challenges that come with its lack of recent combat experience, and it's continuously engaged in a rigorous form of self-assessment and self-criticism, and all of this provides a clear indication of its willingness and determination to adapt and reform. And as I note throughout the book, when operating under the terrible pressures of a major war, determined adversaries can sometimes overcome their initial lack of expertise relatively quickly to attain competitive levels of proficiency. And while in a limited Sino-US war, for example, an early setback in the South or East China Seas might prove critical, within the context of a more protracted confrontation over a potentially existential issue such as Taiwan, such a humiliation may simply serve as the required stimulus for creative reform. Now, if we look at the second axes that I alluded to earlier, the industrial requirements, the socioeconomic aspects of the conflict in between the US and China. So here I actually found it helpful to sort of disaggregate the lines of inquiry into two broad categories. So the sort of structural elements and longer term trends that are likely to exert a decisive impact on each competitor's broader societal resiliency, and then the factors that would more specifically affect Washington and Beijing's capacity for military mobilization, sustainment, and regeneration. And so here what I concluded at first was that, contrary perhaps to some of the prevailing doom and gloom in Washington, the geopolitical fundamentals of the US's continued primacy remain quite strong. So its privileged geographical position, its wealth of natural resources, the continued dominance of the dollar as the global reserve currency, the US's newfound status as a net energy exporter. The US remains the world's largest and most innovative economy, while China's economy, as we all know, is facing more turbulent headwinds. And in addition, China suffers from a number of structural challenges, so ranging from resource and arable land shortages to demographic decline to the political uncertainties that are tied to Xi Jinping's succession, and to the much broader looming question of whether the regime can maintain the sustained levels of economic growth that are essential to its legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people. But when it comes to evaluating both nations' current capacities to sustain and regenerate military strength, however, and I very much doubt this is going to come as a surprise to you or to your listeners, China clearly holds the upper hand. So since the end of the Cold War, the US industrial base has severely atrophied, as has its merchant fleet, and a combination of cyber and supply chain vulnerabilities and critical materials such as rare earths, for example, have rendered US procurement far more exposed to internal disruption. And so the country's capacity to rapidly replenish munition stocks in the event of a protracted conflict is in serious doubt, as is its ability to guarantee its capacity for industrial resiliency, mobilization, sustainment, and regeneration, all of the elements which would prove absolutely critical in the event of a protracted Sino-US war. So it's that aspect of the Sino-US military competition that is of most concern to US policymakers, I would say, and that is rightly receiving the most attention, especially since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which has only served to highlight the importance of mass sustainment and regeneration.
Yeah, that would be the factors that I would look at on this would be the savagery, but also the efficiency that comes with an authoritarian regime, and that indoctrination that can have a use case too in the way that you fight as well. If you do fight in a more attritional sense, that can actually have, I believe, from someone who is a highly professional infantryman, you'd be like, we're just not fighting like that. It may actually have an effect, but you look at just the sheer industrial capacity of China, from the ability to pump out Navy. They're outstripping the rest of the world in Navy ships, in shells, in name it, and they're building it. And the quality.
It's the largest military buildup in world history.
And the quality of these items is not what it used to be either. There's this idea that Chinese quality sucks. I have a friend that works in very high-end titanium machining, and he was very having difficulties wanting to move production to China, and he said it's better than he could get done anywhere in the West, and for significantly cheaper, which him and I spoke about. This is for a complete other business, completely out of the military sphere, but I thought that's not something that a lot of people share the idea of. Or you need to look at a BYD car compared to a Tesla, and you think, oh, they're not very far behind on this. You touched on some of those issues that China have, but you touched on the book too about how more maybe alliance or relationships with Russia could potentially solve some of these issues as well for the Chinese. You speak of grain. Russia is a massive exporter of grain. A naval blockade. A naval blockade where China has sea access, that is null and void if they then could have ability to access then Russian ports, and of course Russia as well for resource, not only critical resource, oil and gas, but also strategic resource such as titanium again. And I believe you touch on nuclear propulsion and high efficiency engines as well. Some areas. How much does that relationship concern where there's Washington in front of Beijing? Where does a growing relationship between Russia and China, how much does that concern those areas of which we may have the upper hand?
I think it's a huge concern, and not only the ever tightening defense and technological relationship in between China and Russia, but also the growing ties within what some folks here have called the axis of upheaval, or the axis of authoritarians, or the quartet of chaos. I just like to call it the phalanx of thuggery. Folks like the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Russians, and the Chinese. The extent to which this military and intelligence cooperation has been gathering pace in recent years, I think has perhaps come to a surprise to some folks here in Washington. For a long time, the somewhat conventional narrative was that the China-Russian relationship was primarily tactical, transactional, and it lacked a certain depth due to residual mistrust, which would prevent it from metamorphosizing into a genuine alliance. The reality of the matter is that we've seen that move much closer to at least what we could call a proto-alliance in recent years than we would have anticipated. And in the case of North Korea and Russia, who've actually signed a formal security agreement, I think that one could clearly argue that it falls now under the definition of a military alliance. So, in my opinion, the only answer to this is to not only engage in intelligent forward thinking and planning by, for example, sort of thinking through the implications of for example, China having permanent access to Russian Pacific basing infrastructure, thinking through what that might mean for US and allied force posture and strategy in the region. So on the one hand, we have to think ahead. I also think that it's the strongest argument that one could have for tightening relationships between our own network of alliances. Building those military but also industrial interconnections in between European and Asian allies.
There's been
and the United States, of course.
I spoke on this briefly yesterday. Yesterday was the 14th of February, because I'm not sure when this video is going to be coming out. I think that Trump has a massive fear of the rise of China. We saw that in his first term, and we'll see it come into his second term more. And I do believe that there is this idea, and it's not foundless, it's based on a lot, because of the war in Ukraine, because of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, then the sanctions that were placed, the rhetoric that has been said, the messaging, everything around this, by cutting off energy, placing sanctions, all of this, we have pushed Russia closer to China, then potentially we may have had on slightly a leash. And I think a lot of the Trump administration's decisions that may be affecting Ukraine's sovereignty is made through the lens of that we may be able to draw Russia back on our side on a leash a little bit more, rather than completely just into the arms of Xi Jinping, into China, and the problems that can then face. And I do believe, and we even see this through some messaging of the US administration at the moment, that wanting some level of relationship again with Russia. I think people underestimate some of the technologies or the geographical areas that China would be interested in with Russia. And I think we may see the US administration take steps to build, and as I say in my video, it's not kumbaya singing around the campfire military alliance, but it is, are we better off keeping an enemy close and keep your enemies closer than your friends? Because can we just then by this push them into the arms of the Chinese, and the Chinese would want nothing more than that? It solves a lot of issues. What is your towards that train of thinking, at least?
I mean, I couldn't speak for the folks in the Trump administration and whether that that line of thought is animating their policies. I would simply say that I don't think that I don't think that the Russians or the Chinese need us to draw closer. They're united by a shared hatred of the West. They have plenty of, as we alluded to, private mercenary reasons to draw much closer together. I tend to think that the folks who kind of argue that we could have, at some stage sort of done a reverse Kissinger or whatever you want to call it, and sort of draw Russia away from China and sort of cajole it into becoming our partner. I don't think that was ever realistic, given the depths of antagonism in both countries and towards the West, and the deep-seated paranoia that characterizes their regimes. So I think occasionally one also has to recognize the agency of adversarial actors, and also our own limitations sometimes when it comes to either bringing other countries together or forcing them apart.
Yes. You speak on the book, and you've spoken in the interview about areas where where China may have the edge and where Washington may have the edge in different sectors. How much of an effect has this recent released artificial intelligence, people will know it as DeepSeek, but China outwardly showing their artificial intelligence capability? How much of effect has that had in how people calculate how a protracted war may look with China? Thinking we had the upper edge on that, I don't know if we do or not, but I think what we do know is that gap has been closed a fair bit from what we believed it was. How do you think that will affect things or decisions made moving forwards?
So I think, first of all, that it's not a coincidence if DeepSeek was released to great fanfare just a few days after the election or during the election. I can't remember if was it just before the election or during the election. In any event, I don't think that the timing. I don't think that the timing of that was coincidental. I also think that, for one, the US is still clearly ahead when it comes to the quality of its LLMs, compute power, the quality of its chips, etc. But I also think that it shows that the gap is a lot less wide than some folks had initially hoped or anticipated. The Chinese clearly were very successful at distilling American design models, and more broadly, they're very talented when it comes to applying applying technologies at scale and applying US designed technologies at scale. In terms of the policy ramifications, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as, the equivalent of a Sputnik moment, but I do think it's only reinforced the belief here across party lines that the US needs to invest massively in the race towards what people are calling artificial general intelligence or superintelligence, i.e. Form of artificial intelligence which will be able to perform more effectively than a human being across most fields of intellectual endeavor, that it's important to win that race and to win that competition primarily so that China doesn't. I think that the big debate going forward is how does one balance that with legitimate safety concerns, and then also whether in the future it makes sense to continue to engage in sort of open source development and release strategies, or whether it's more sound to sort of adopt a more sort of proprietary and closed form of research when it comes to developing AI. And there are strong arguments in both directions, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that particular debate plays out, the open source versus proprietary development debate.
Yeah, it does seem like to me that yes, the Chinese are behind, but their trajectory is much faster, and that on the current trajectory that there will be a moment in a lot of spheres of overtaking. We don't know if it's years or decades, or if it will occur before China hit real problems around population. What do you make of China's hybrid or unrestricted warfare, throughout areas, Belt and Road initiatives down to, through Africa, through the Indo-Pacific, through these areas, especially, relating, I guess, Australia as well. We get involved in a lot of this. How much success are they having with this unrestricted warfare and expansion through non-military means?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, one that I'd love to respond to at length. But unfortunately, I do have to head off to another meeting in 5 minutes,
yeah.
which is too bad because I'm really enjoying this conversation.
I didn't even look at the time. It all gets on me always.
All right. It's flown by. It's been such a fascinating discussion. So I actually think it's been hugely counterproductive for China. It's coercive activities and its near abroad. If you look at recent Pew polling over the past few years, for example, it's pretty revealing in the sense that it shows that Beijing's regional assertiveness, its bombastic wolf warrior diplomacy, whatever you want to call it, when combined with its actions in Hong Kong, its continued lack of transparency regarding the origins of COVID-19, which I think most people now clearly believe was spawned in a Chinese lab. All of this has really dented its soft power, with public perceptions of China really cratering across both Asia and Europe. So in many ways, it's gray zone assertiveness, while extremely concerning from an escalation management and crisis stability perspective, is also extremely counterproductive, I think, for the Chinese.
Very interesting. Look, that's something we can go over at another time, mate. Look, you are welcome back, Iskander, at any time. You and I chat offline. Sure. Anytime you want to discuss something or something comes out, you're always more than welcome. Is there anything that you'd like to leave, I guess, the audience with around warfare, with around information, anything? Or is there anything you're doing that you'd like to plug to the audience as well?
Oh, that's very, very kind of you. Not really, to be honest. Just I would like to express my gratitude to you for having me on the podcast. And also, to show your audience my deep love of Australia. I've only been down under once, or actually twice, because I came as an infant when my parents traveled through the Australian outback for 6 months, but I'd love to come back at some point. And you're a critical ally of the United States, and there are a lot of people in this town and in this country who have a huge amount of love and respect for what you bring to our alliance. So thank you for that.
Oh, anytime. Look, mate, you have a fantastic day.
Thanks.
And yeah, if there's anything you ever need, let us know.
I appreciate it.
Easy. Thank you, mate.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.